Hello. The Learning Future is partnering with BFX to explore how thoughtful learning design matters, both for students and their learning. Today, I'm delighted to host a conversation around the ideas of culture, learning, and place with school designer Daniel Smith. He's the managing director of Leaf Architecture, who specialises in education. And Daniel is also the previous national chair of Learning Environments Australia and New Zealand, the peak body that brings together education and design. Welcome, Daniel. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here today. Um,
So I'd love to start with you telling us a little bit about Leaf Architecture and particularly its connection to education and why you landed there.
mhm. I think if I dial the clock back a little bit further than perhaps the start of Leaf, and that will help, I guess, provide that foundation. As a young architect, after I graduated, I was particularly fortunate to work with a practice that specialised in schools.
Mhm.
So that was, I guess, my introduction to the architecture profession. And through, I guess, many years of working with some of Australia's most innovative educators, as an example, I started to learn a little bit more about the depth of what we were designing, and I guess the understanding and the science around teaching and learning. And that's where I started to develop a bit of a love of that. And then, if we, I guess, wind the clock forward to prior to the establishment of Leaf Architecture, by that point, I had developed a strong passion. And that passion had been fueled by some really marvelous opportunities to work with various educators who were really, I guess, driven by making the world a better place. And I think that's really foundational with schools. We
Mhm.
are improving the quality, I guess, of people's lives. We're improving um, uh, the opportunities for people, irrespective of where they've come from. And that's where education is an enabler. And education architecture can assist through that process.
Mm.
Working with organisations like Learning Environments Australasia has been really, I guess, an inspiration as well in terms of understanding what we can do and how we can have those impacts. So it became, I guess, a real, I guess, an obvious answer to a lot of extent to build a practice around the types of projects where the passion and the heart kind of sits. And I think that's where Leaf was really designed to accommodate school projects or education architecture. And then we've also broadened that focus now to also include community. But at the end of the day, our test of is this project one of ours is, are we going to improve people's lives with this, rather than perhaps just make some people some money. We want to have I guess, that lasting impact, and then I think that helps in terms of obviously through the course of an architecture project. Um, there are ups and there are downs. There's some challenging times and there's some inspiring times. And to be honest, if you know that you're making the world a bit of a better place, it helps you get out of bed and do all those things that you need to do. And
Mm.
that became a real foundation thing for us.
Fantastic. So, in your work with school, particularly in these 10 years since you've been I- with, you have commenced Leaf. So, what evolution have you seen that really excites you the most as we prepare young people for the future of work and life through the lens of the built environment? And let's think about that in its broader sense, not just the buildings, but the surrounding in between spaces as well.
I think that's a really good question, because I guess looking at that last 10 years, I think clients are now a heck of a lot more informed as well in terms of the outcomes that they're hoping to achieve. They may or may not know the ingredients we need to put into the mix to enable the environment to facilitate these desires, but the conversations, I think, have improved. And I think a lot of that comes down to some of the good work of some of our, I guess, eminent researchers in the space, and a lot of the national conversations that we're having, and the international conversations that we're having around some of these things. So I think when I guess, towards the specifics, I'm seeing a lot more nuanced design that is more considerate for a broader array of people.
Mm,
When I first started in education architecture, I think the premise was around that median student that doesn't actually exist, and we designed spaces to accommodate that individual. We designed social spaces, play spaces, sports spaces, all these sorts of things to accommodate a median student. We're now starting to talk and champion a diverse array of people. I think the depth of the conversations we're now having around neurodivergent learners or students with anxiety or people with different accessible needs, all of these things are now, I guess, adding depth because if we design for a broader array, everyone actually benefits from that. It's not just, for instance, some of these other people that we're designing for, because in reality, once again, the median student doesn't exist. So
mm,
um, we've got now some conversations that I think we just have matured and some conversations that are now off the table. As an
mm,
example, like I very rarely need to, I guess, sell a message of acoustic treatment in a learning space now,
mm,
which is really fabulous because
mm,
foundationally, if you can't hear, you can't learn.
mm,
Why are
right.
we building?
And
If we don't
mm,
build well, and I'm not meaning expensively, if we don't
mm,
build well, then it becomes a challenge for our young people to
mm,
participate. And then
mm,
other things, I think, I guess there are opportunities through difficulties, and COVID, I think, has helped rise a conversation around the spatial quality, so that indoor environmental quality that we need so that people can thrive. And some of that might be, for instance, ventilation. And once again, I like to come back to some simple but repeatable phrases in the sense that I want it to be an earworm. And one of those other things is if you want to educate, you have to ventilate. So
nice.
we do create spaces sometimes that put people to sleep. People could be learners, teachers. It actually doesn't make any difference. But I think specifically the learner, if we look at a traditional learning space as an example, where we've got 30 kids in a row, they're not allowed to move. We now put them in a stuffy box and we want them to perform in their peak.
Mm,
We're really tying a hand behind their back
mm,
when they need to be given leverage, essentially, to explore their learning and delve into it deeply. So I think some of those qualitative things are being addressed alongside, I guess, a more targeted approach to a diverse array of learners. And I think
mm,
then to sort of cap that statement off, the depth around the conversations we're having around pedagogy is also a lot deeper than what we once had. And often it was just the catch cry of a word that we needed to use in a meeting, as an example, where even, for instance, an educator couldn't quite articulate some of
no.
those things.
Mm,
But I'm finding that is the conversations now are vastly superior to that. And I think then taking that step back and looking at not just in terms of our work, but also the industry's work, the quality of the work out there is improving
mm,
remarkably. But there's still more work to do.
mm. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That I guess I can track my involvement in that intersection of school design and learning about 15 years ago. And I know the spaces that I was seeing then um, didn't attend to those personal, what do we call those? You know, the human qualities of the ventilation and the
Mm,
acoustics and the good lighting and the access to outdoors. They weren't attended to as much. And I remember thinking that often the first thing to go on a budget line was the acoustics back then, wasn't it? You know, we could get
exactly.
the space and fit it out and make it look wonderful, but nobody could work well in it because the reverberation was out of control. So it's really great to see those sorts of things coming in, and yeah, ventilation is a critical thing. I remember when I was working in schools, you'd walk into a room and go, "Oh my gosh," because no windows were open. There were 25 bodies in there, and it's like that frog in the kettle, isn't it? That just
Mm,
you're in it, you don't know, but you do wonder why that student's falling asleep because
yeah.
the carbon dioxide is so thick
And
in the room.
And add a few more challenges to that as well. Like if you're, for instance, in a year 6 classroom and you're after lunch, perhaps some of those kids haven't yet learned the art of deodorant.
No,
And
it's
some of that
true.
environment starts to become actually really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So we really need to think about those qualitative elements and how we design for human beings. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things that I sometimes reflect on, and you and I were both involved in it wasn't a podcast, it was what was it? A webinar. There we are. However many years ago with Oliver Heath. And one of the
Oh,
things he said is if you close your eyes and imagine where are you most peaceful, where are you most calm yourself, everyone describes nature, and we can take
mm,
those cues from that and design that into our spaces to help
mm,
improve those qualitative elements, which
mm,
helps with a whole array of different things. Well-being being a big part of that,
mm,
but also at the same time, if we look at it perhaps from a business or an organizational perspective, a lot of the research will demonstrate that people have less sick leave, people will have less issue or fewer issues with anxiety, fewer
mm,
issues with other issues that would normally bubble to the surface if we're
mm.
putting them in the wrong environment. So the
Yeah.
investment does show immediate returns. It perhaps just doesn't you don't necessarily always look at that in terms of
Mm,
that bottom line component, but it's certainly something that I think need to be integrated into, I would dare say, every project. But
mm.
I'd love to see that floor of the industry lifted to accommodate at least some of those baseline levels.
Yeah, I've even some research that in a book that I have, whose name escapes me unfortunately, but they were talking about the health benefits of access to nature, and we know
Mhm.
that, and being able to see nature, go out in it. But they even found that if you don't have a window that looks onto nature, pictures on the walls
Yeah.
of natural elements.
Hmm.
Or even I know of teachers who are in these sort of confined rooms who will put a slideshow of just lovely nature photos while the students
Yeah.
are arriving. And just those calming elements like that, just
Hmm.
even though we're not actually, it's not physical nature, but it's actually the image of it
Yeah.
is actually
So
making a difference as well.
we would refer to that as biomimicry. So there's a whole
Oh,
bunch of different
there
things
you
that
go.
we can do
Yeah.
with that. So if
Mm.
our baseline would be, for instance, natural light, natural ventilation,
Mm,
natural
mm,
materials. And once we then take steps outside of that, I would say the view line to something natural, be it a tree in a courtyard, even if it's even something as simple as that.
yeah.
And then the colors, the rhythm of colors, the
Mm,
proportion of colors, and some of those elements, for instance, can be quite good. If you can see little samples of the carpet behind us, we're kind of taking cues of that in our studio here. And then further to that, then imagery, if we are liking those views, we can always create a view. It's just how we get there as a designer needs to perhaps be sometimes a bit more creative and a little bit,
yeah.
I guess, inventful as to how we achieve that. But I think
Mm,
also just kind of hit those marks, understanding place and that sort of endemic response, then I think some of that should also be considered rather than perhaps just showing a picture of a European lake and a forest as an example. Show something relevant to us because it actually becomes
yes.
a little bit more
Yeah.
relatable as an
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's good. So what do you see as that impact of that thoughtfully designed learning environments? And I guess what we're saying when we say thoughtfully designed, it's not just the walls around us, it's not just the windows, it's not just the furniture, it's the package, right? And
yeah.
the impact on student and staff well-being from, projects that you might have done a few years ago, what are you seeing are some of the benefits that might come
Yeah.
when you hear back or you visit
So
or something like that?
one of the first projects we were fortunate to work on was there was a five-story building at the Maronite College of the Holy Family in Harris Park, and
Mm,
one of the comments that we had from the assistant principal at the time, who's since been promoted, was the behaviour of students in this building is a lot more calm. So
wow.
if we start to think about, I guess, particularly in a high school environment, as an example, where you get those 16-year-old brutes and they're all perhaps finding it a bit difficult to sit once again for extended periods of time and focus on something that they find hard. Um, what we don't want to do is find other challenges, I guess, to
Mm,
that. So
mm,
in some of these spaces, we actually get those impacts where behavior is a little bit more calm. Now, if the
mm,
behavior of the students is more calm, there's actually ripples that start to come through the school with
totally.
that. The impact of the teacher's well-being, for instance, is that the environment becomes less stressful. They can also increase their critical thinking about how they might provide individual learning opportunities or how
Mm,
they might assist with a deeper learning opportunity by applying perhaps more crafted questions to
Mm.
delve into critical
That's
thinking
right.
and
That's right.
creative responses. But if people are sitting in fight or flight, they're not getting to some of those deeper
No.
areas. We're really sitting and just bubbling around in shallow learning, which, without me going off too much on a rant, I think as a country like Australia or even our New Zealand cousins, we are wealthy nations. We can achieve a lot but we just need to be intentful with what we have as an example, rather than complaining about what we may have missed out on.
Yeah.
The resources we afford schools, in terms of capital works budgets and even, for instance, intentful furniture selection and all those sorts of things, we just need to be considerate with those choices and understand the impacts. And that's where I think the research, for instance, is really important and powerful. Like when you look at the work of Professor Wesley Imms and Dr. Ben Cleveland, yourself, and many others, it's really foundational work that has global impact and
Mm.
reach. And we've got it on our back door. And we just need
Mm.
to lean into that, I think, a little bit more so that when we're making those decisions, we're making it from a basis
Mm.
of an informed position rather than
Mm.
I saw that on another project and I thought it looked cool. So I thought I might give it a crack myself. We need to not kind of experiment with our young people. Our young people deserve that investment of our time.
Mm.
But also, I guess, that sense of innate curiosity to delve into a subject matter a little bit deeply, i.e., the impact of space on teaching and learning, because the research is out there.
Mm.
It just
Mm.
takes a bit of time, I guess, from a designer's perspective to delve into it, but also from an educator's perspective. And that's where I love the impact of organisations such as Learning Environments Australasia, because
Yeah.
it's all about, I guess, lifting that conversation across the entire sector.
Yeah. It does. It makes a huge difference. But, even small things we talk about staff, teacher well-being,
Mm,
when you talk about a calm environment, eh, the biggest, one of the biggest problems with teaching is voice
mm,
and the damage that's done to throats and, raising voices. The more the environment attends to these other things, creates that calm environment, there's one risk factor that's mitigated just a little because that sense of
that's it.
trying to get you heard over the melee
Mhm.
is something that's no longer as critical to them. And I know
Yeah.
voice issues are huge with teachers.
It's huge, and then think of the impacts, either compensation claims, time off
Totally.
work. We've got a teacher shortage. What we don't need is our teachers having sick leave or personal
Yeah.
leave in that instance, and then we have to find replacements for them. So it starts to create a snowball effect. But if we kind of deal with a lot of these things at its source, when we have the affordance of a capital works budget in that instance, then I think we can actually create some really meaningful outcomes. But it just comes back to that intent, to be when we make a design decision, be intentful with that. And I think some of our, I guess, foundational statements as a company here at Leaf is um, to be human-centered, research-driven design. And
Yes.
each of those words mean a lot for us.
Mm. Mm.
Human-centered, because we always have to remember we're designing for people, be
Yeah.
it learners, teachers, administration, clerical people,
Sure.
whatever. They're all just people. All the needs are essentially fairly similar, but
Mm.
also understanding that broad array of learners
Mm.
and then
Mm.
have that foundation of research. It should be driven by research. We're not researchers, but we are active observers in the industry, so
Mm.
we can make those informed choices. And I think then the benefit of that really sits in a multi-layered approach, be it our learners, be it our teachers or educators, sorry, and all the ancillary people that help support a school.
Mm.
All of those people deserve to have that approach to well-being, but
Mm.
also understanding what's the intent behind these facilities.
Mm.
The intent is to improve our young people's learning. It has to do both. It can't just
Mm.
focus on the one.
We're at the Learning Future and some of the strategic work that we're doing. We are talking to students and in essence, gathering a body of data around students' feelings and responses about school. And I'm just in the middle of transcribing one of those sets of data at the moment. But I find it fascinating the amount of times the students raise the issue of the physical environment and how that makes them feel. and
Mm,
it's not just something that is a container to them. Uh,
mm,
and they talk about, we want to go outside. We want to have more learning outside. We feel constrained. There's a whole lot of both positives and negatives that they talk about. So they are attuned. The students are attuned to this, and we need to recognise and I think hear their voice more in this process. Do you
mm.
talk to students? Do you hear from them?
We do always encourage that, and
Yeah,
sometimes I think it
it's
comes
hard, isn't
down
it?
to it is. It comes down, I think, to I guess the willingness of the principal to be
That's right.
brave.
That's right.
And when I say brave, like in a lot of respects, the kids, generally speaking, aren't making sort of nonsense claims or whatnot. They're actually quite considered. So,
Mm. No.
um, yeah, you're going to have some creative things like I want to have a slippery dip or I want a rocket
Yeah,
ship or whatever.
yeah.
But the at the heart of it
You
all,
read through that stuff. Yeah.
we've got some really insightful observations around their spaces for learning
Mm.
and how
Mm.
they like to, I guess, position themselves when they're doing various tasks. And I think we've got to stop thinking about a learning environment that does all things for all people and start thinking, in my opinion, about the suite of spaces and that
Yeah.
nuanced design that we can have to allow people to do different things when they need to. As an example, we
Yeah.
wouldn't design a workplace like that. And that is a really bastion of the past where
Mm.
all of your work happens in this little patch and nothing can happen outside of that.
Mm.
No one talks like that anymore, but we
No.
do still for schools. And I
Yeah.
think other things that kind of just sit and resonate in me, we attended the regional day out with Learning Environments Australasia on Friday, and there was a comment made by, I think it was Matthew Esterman, around just something simple and human, such as controlling people's toilet breaks.
Yeah.
We would never think like that in a workplace
Yeah.
environment. If you need to use the bathroom, you go to the bathroom. If you're
Yeah.
thirsty, you go and get some water and come back because you want to keep your body feeling
Yeah.
optimized to do the
Yeah.
tasks that you're doing. But we don't actually provide those that human approach sometimes
Mm.
with our learning space because
Mm.
it all comes back to various constructs like the
Mm.
timetable and perhaps also thinking about still we are still informed by those industrial models of
Mm.
education.
Mm.
But it is getting better. And I
Mm.
think it is worth reflecting on. I had the good fortune of working with learning spaces for well over 20 years now, and the trajectory has improved remarkably. But um, it's just kind of keeping some of those founding principles about who we're
Mm.
designing for and how do we enable some of those things to happen. Like none of us would sit at a desk all day without perhaps looking at different things and moving around a space and sort of
Mm.
navigating to suit our needs.
Mm.
I think we just got to keep that sense of empathy for our learner. And once we do that, the added benefits are actually quite layered. If I'm moving around, the body is getting the blood flow moving through my body.
Mm.
It's oxygenating the body, which is also helping me maintain and improve my concentration. Once I
Mm.
get to some of these points, I can encourage that learner then to get towards engagement. And once we've got them engaged, we can now start to get them to a deeper learning. Now,
Yeah.
in order to do that, we've got to take some things off the table. Their needs as a human being just need to be addressed. And now we need to think more thoughtfully around learning spaces. So it's one thing to describe pedagogy in sort of metaphoric and broad, ambiguous terms, but we've actually got to delve and do the work and get into the detail around the learning settings as an example. And once we start to design the learning setting, we are in effect creating the architectural brief from that. But I think
Yeah.
this is the cue of the designer, because the designer, in my opinion, shouldn't be trying to get the educator to convert their language to talk to an architect. It needs to be the reverse. We need to
Yeah.
be curious around
Awesome.
the people that we're designing for, be
Yeah.
empathetic to
Mm-hmm.
understand them
Mm-hmm.
and learn how they talk to each other as
Mm.
peers so we
Excellent.
can help them translate their goal into the built
Mm.
environment. And I think that's the test of a good architect.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah, and it's interesting how you talk about that. You're not essentially you are designing empty spaces that need to be filled, and how we fill that is
Mm,
that conversation. How we do the external as well matters, but then the conversation, which I guess where we think about the role of furniture, in
Mm,
shaping that learning experience for students. And I know the space behind you. I know that we can see some sort of workstations, but there are different places in your space there at Leaf that
mm,
are serving different purposes, and they have different furniture. So what
mm.
have you noticed around designing the spaces for learning with that idea of flexibility in mind?
So I think in terms of that, it's now developing some maturity in the conversation and it's getting a lot more broader. So
Mm,
coming back to those learning settings and understanding some of the needs of our learners through that process, I think those conversations are improving. And I think when that comes down to some components like we want the students to be accessing resources through the course of the lesson so they can stay in flow for the in a lot of respects. It's now a lot more commonplace to not think about I need a chair to anchor that student because once you
mm,
sit in a chair, you're not getting up and down as much as
mm,
an
mm,
example. So in that instance, we can be a bit more thoughtful, maybe keep people on their feet in that instance or have a
mm,
stool, and that becomes a little bit more of an agile environment.
mm,
Then we can start to look at everything from, for instance, the shape of the table to
mm,
how we leave some gaps. So, staying on the shape of the table, so some of the things might be, as an example, if you think about other scenarios in the community, would you have a conversation, for instance, at a bus stop? Do you think sitting in a row is a really good way to
mm,
engage in a conversation with other
mm,
people?
mm,
It's uncomfortable. So, why do we put our kids in a learning environment where we do that to them? So,
mm,
having things, for instance, like even just the shape of a table and having a bit of a splay so I can still more comfortably make eye contact with my peers. And as soon as we
mm,
do that, we're starting to address some of those human components and we start to enable it to be a little bit more comfortable to lean in and participate.
mm,
So, and then thinking about perhaps leaving space. So, the space might be, for instance, one of the things we like to do sometimes with our learning environments is always leave a gap for the educator. So, if we're trying to get, for instance, some project based learning or inquiry driven learning or self driven learning, whatever I guess the benchmark of pedagogy is in
mm,
that space, we often forget what it's like to for the learner in that instance
mm,
to engage with that educator. What
mm,
you don't really like doing, I guess, in a lot of respects, if you're seated and someone's standing right beside you, towering over you, you now feel uncomfortable. But if having those eye level conversations, we allow the educator to insert themselves into these learning settings, such as having a gap at the end of the table, as an example, which
mm,
is an
mm,
obvious answer to that, enable some of those peer to peer conversations to happen more naturally. And now
mm,
we can start to get to a really strong position where we've started to deal with the needs of the conversation that drives that learning and that engagement. And now we can start to look at how we capture some of that learning and how we help our learners get to a higher level of critique,
mm,
for instance, in some
mm,
of those
mm,
discussions, such
mm,
as we've done a lot of work over the years with some really I guess, strong and I guess affirmative type educators, and they would sometimes refer to these things as points of engagement, or perhaps if we're using some other terms like learning affordances, as an
yeah,
example,
yeah,
where is having a writable table surface, having a tablet that might connect to a table, things where we can start to display our learning. So,
mm,
like the concept that we're doing at the moment, I'm talking to you about a concept. You're trying to imagine that space that I'm trying to describe, and we may or may not be on the same page, and
mm,
that's okay. But if we can start to use visual aids or start to describe some of those things, and we leave artifacts for us then to perhaps not, for instance, direct the feedback to me because I'm just
mm,
the one that said it, as an example. We now start to direct the feedback to the artifact.
mm,
We depersonalize the feedback. So we actually start to create an environment where we can have those deeper conversations without it feeling as confronting, because we're not
mm,
saying that what you said isn't right or whatever. It's just we're now talking over the artifact. And now we can start to layer in, I guess, almost like the concept of improv, yes, and I
Mm,
see your point. What if we look at blah? Because then we get that narrative and that overlay of various other people's experiences, and we now start to show the power of learning soft skills in a learning environment because we can
mm,
show when you have different people working together, the result is greater than the sum of the parts. And
mm,
but the space that we provide, those learning affordances, those learning
mm,
settings, will
mm,
actually define whether those kids get to that point or not. And that's where that intent comes from the beginning. And I think furniture has an incredible place to play with that. And then we can layer in a whole range of other issues on top of that, such as movement in a classroom, as an
mm.
example. And I'm intentionally using the word classroom in that
Yeah,
instance.
it's common
Um,
language.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And I think we've all had that point where we're sitting beside the boy who's like fit, like just needs to get that energy out.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
rather than compete with that, just create a learning environment that actually enables that. Once
yeah.
again, thinking about
Exactly. Go with it.
when do we want people seated? Where do we want people standing? When do we want people moving around the space? And we start
Yeah,
to perhaps think about some
yeah.
of that flow, and then we can reverse engineer the design of that environment to
Mm,
reflect that. And I think there's no greater tool, to be honest, than the design of the furniture and the selection thereof to help enable that.
yeah. Agreed. And the other side of that with furniture that I thought of while you were talking was I like to use the term allowing for empty space.
Mm,
And so that we've just sometimes I'm sure you've seen it as well. Beautiful furniture, great ideas behind it, but just too much. And
mm,
that
mm.
sense of being able to have, I always say empty space allows for opportunities.
Yeah,
So you can gather a few chairs over there, or if they are doing some student initiated learning, they can roll out this thing on the floor and get around it. So it's just that finding that balance between, the sweet spot, isn't it? Between
exactly.
Goldilocks principle,
I,
not too much, not too little, just right in the middle.
That's
So
it. I
yeah,
would refer to that as a loose fit, as an example.
nice,
And
nice.
we can, as designers, I think, sometimes get to the point where we over design, where we try to
Yeah,
solve all of the problems. But in that instance, we've actually got to step back and let the next layer happen by the users in that space,
totally,
the
totally.
educators, the students, and whatnot. And I reflect on, I recently had the good fortune of touring a school, which I won't name. Beautiful school, the natural environment that was brought into the space was all hitting the mark. But then you look at the wall surfaces as an example, and I would argue that they were over designed in that instance. There was no opportunity for learning scaffolds in the space, or very limited thereof,
Mm,
because of
mm.
I guess, a really highly textured wall surface. The space
Yep,
was beautiful,
yeah,
but what happened then? Every flat surface, so every door, every column, every anything that they could get their hands on, was all plastered with
yeah,
learning scaffolds. What
yeah,
we've actually done in that space is not actually design, I guess, for that last layer of design, which will evolve and adapt over the course of the lifespan of that
yeah,
build.
yeah,
And I think that can be a little bit of a pity, and it is something which almost feels nonsensical to the architect. Like, don't do that last step; let the user do
yeah,
that. And I guess that inner control freak as an architect says, "What if they get it wrong? But what if they get it right? And
yeah,
what if they adapt to the changing needs?"
yeah,
And we've got to keep that. So I agree with your point
yeah.
wholeheartedly.
Well, I think that's our time coming to an end. And Daniel, what I feel at the moment is that we have just let people into a conversation that you and I have all the time. Do you know, Daniel and I talk about this stuff. We have a shared passion around learning spaces, effective learning space design, and how the pedagogy can be enhanced by the space around it. So I just want to take a time to say thank you. A busy day, busy time of the year, but really appreciate the time that you took to spend to talk with us today. Um, and thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I really appreciate the invite to participate with this podcast.